how much better can AJ get compared to how much better can Usyk get?
Exactly. The amount that the temperature will play in strategy shouldn't be underestimated.
And they've learned how to cope with the demands of what Usyk brings.
If it's to the body, there's going to be more contribution from the core and lower body. But because he's boxing a southpaw, he has to try and come over the top, so that will have a different physiological implication as well.
Before we went into all this, I was thinking Usyk, but I'm more favoured now towards AJ before we looked at it. Hello everybody, welcome to Boxing Science. In this video, we're going to be breaking down the science behind the much anticipated rematch, Usyk versus Joshua. Before we crack on with the scientific breakdown on the punch stats, the tactics, and also the implications of being in Saudi Arabia in terms of the heat, just want you to do us a quick favour, leave your predictions in the comment box below, and let's see whether the scientific breakdown sways your prediction, whether you're going to go for the revenge of Anthony Joshua, or is it going to be a repeat win from Alexander Usyk? We've got Dr. Heat himself, Dr. Alan Ruddock, who's a specialist in heat training and heat acclimation. Alan, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. We've got some interesting stats and numbers and some implications, or maybe not as well.
Cool. So, we were doing these quite a lot, weren't we? Back in the day, analysing the big fights. I remember doing one on Groves versus Eubank, and a lot of the AJ fights as well, because obviously that brought a lot of interest. And we talked a lot about the punch stats of AJ, the weights and what his opponent brings as well. So we've got a backlog of data, and also we've been looking at some of the data as well with the last fight. So in this video, we're going to be looking at some data. We're not going to be going too technical because we're not the people to talk about it. Punch stats aren't everything, but it does have an implication on the physical performance. And a lot of people have been talking about AJ's weight, Usyk's weight, the pace of the last fight, the heat of Saudi Arabia in the summer. So these are some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to start off with a big one, really. And, towards the back end of the fight, AJ looked physically tired, and he has done before, and people have criticised his gas tank. But that fight was at such a high pace. Usyk has been known to mentally fatigue and physically fatigue his opponents. It seemed like AJ at the end, he just literally was hanging off the ropes, and when he got into the corner, was just so physically tired. And a lot of people criticise his gas tank, but actually when you look at the stats, AJ threw a massive 641 punches in that fight, which is nearly double of what he's thrown previously in 11 and 12 round fights. So that's a much, much higher pace than what he's normally done before. Just before I throw it over to you, Alan, because obviously he's only gone 11 and 12 rounds a handful of times, compared his punch stats per round for his World Championship fights, excluding Charles Martin, because that was just a 2-round job and not much data to go off. He normally throws 36 punches per round to land 12, giving him a 34% connection ratio. Against Usyk, he threw 53 to land 10. And so it's a much higher average in terms of thrown. That's 33%. Landing is landing 24% less. So his connection ratio has gone from 34% down to 19%. Now, from a physiological standpoint, he's done pretty well to go the 12 rounds.
Absolutely. That is, I couldn't believe it when you said he's thrown double what he had done before. And what was the fight? What was in second place?
Second place, Dillian White.
Against Dillian White?
Yeah,
I couldn't believe that.
In 7 rounds, 2015, British title fight.
When you told me that again.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So, although he was, really, really tired, and there could be a number of physical and psychological factors for that, people do question his fitness, but actually when you look at the punch stats, and we do have to say that we don't know exactly how the punch stat data collectors
so this
define
is
a punch.
This is based off CompuBox.
Yeah.
Some people love it, some people loathe it.
Yeah.
When I actually watched the fight, watched the fight back along with the stats, I think a lot was down to like more the feints.
Yeah.
I compared it with the Klitschko fight where AJ wasn't throwing many feints, keeping his quite tight guard. Whereas on this one, with Usyk in the first match, is popping out that jab quite a lot. And actually his jabs have gone up by like 2.5 or 3 times more than what his average is.
Yeah.
His average sits around about 150, 170 jabs per fight. He threw 450 in that fight. So constant and with a southpaw. Sorry, I said that I weren't going to go too technical, but you need to throw out that kind of jab to try and get that range.
Yeah.
And with Usyk just kind of moving around, he's probably throwing that jab out a little bit more. Even though he's not loading up on it, just that activity will increase kind of the cardiovascular demands.
It will do, yeah. What we can't tell is from the numbers is the intent of the punch, the intensity of the punch as well, but also what happens before that punch, what happens before the jab in terms of footwork and movement, what happens afterwards.
Yeah.
And they all have physical qualities that have an imposed physical demand as well. So it's not just simply looking at it as a symbol jab, is it? Just popping out there and saying that is there's a physical cost to just that action only. It's everything else that comes with it as well. Like you say, he's trying to find that range. Yeah. And so he'll be stepping in
forward, and
also
that's an energy demand as well.
The direction of that jab as well. If it's to the body, there's going to be more contribution from the core and lower body. But because he's boxing a southpaw, he has to try and come over the top, doesn't it? Because Usyk shorter, he's coming underneath. So that will have a different physiological implication as well, on the shoulder and where he's throwing that. So it doesn't give us the whole picture, but it does give us some indication of what we saw at the end of the fight when he was visibly extremely fatigued and Usyk was able to step up on there. And I think Usyk's power punches in those last couple of rounds were
increased when we went for the finish. And you were talking about kind of what was happening. Usyk's spending a lot of time on the back foot, making him punch out of range, and that's something that he did to Tony Bellew and done with a lot of his opponents, is stepping in and out of range, making people overreach. That obviously increased the energy demand. Usyk will land in a lot of body shots as well. So that'll obviously take a lot out. But when you think about like in training camp, you've got to prepare for that pacing. And I don't think that anybody will have brought that out. It don't matter how many sprints that you do or air bike sessions or circuits, heavy bag sessions. When you're actually in the ring, you've got to get used to that pace and that intensity. Usyk seems to bring that out of people a lot more. Looking at Usyk's punch stats, even though he won the fight, he threw less. He threw 529 punches compared to AJ's 641, so over 100 less. He landed 25 more than AJ, and he landed 28% of his punches, which is okay. It's all right, but it's showing that it's probably fainting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it was a really high pace, because if you look at the amount of punches that was thrown, 529 on Usyk, 641 on AJ. To put that in perspective, the grueling fight between Fury and Wilder, the third one, that accumulated into 740 punches together in 11 rounds versus 1,164 in AJ versus Usyk 1. So that shows you that really high pace set for heavyweight boxing. Yeah. Now, why is that so physically demanding for a heavyweight boxer to maintain that high pace?
Well, every action for a heavyweight comes at a metabolic cost. And because they're so predominantly muscular, it means that they're weighted more towards anaerobic type energy demand rather than aerobic type. Clearly a heavyweight can't run as fast as, can't perform at the same kind of aerobic intensity as a flyweight can. And so each one of those actions has a disproportionate demand on their aerobic system compared to a flyweight. In effect, they are, and we've talked about this quite a lot, is they're more economical.
Yeah.
So the energy cost of those actions is a lot less for lighter athletes. So when you're a heavyweight, it means you have to be quite selective in the shots that you throw in, because you know it's going to have a big energy demand on the total energy demand of that particular round before you can then recover. When we come to talk about the implications of heat, we can delve into that in a little bit more detail. But essentially, that is why is that, you know, boxing is a high intensity intermittent sport with a large demand on the aerobic energy system. But when you've got these athletes that are predominantly anaerobic in their actions, it places a huge demand on that cardiovascular system. And that's why we see heavyweights visibly more fatigued than we do.
How can a heavyweight boxer prepare for that then, from a strength and conditioning point of view?
In terms of their fitness, they need to be able to deal with the acidosis that comes with those more anaerobic type demands. So because their aerobic system can't support their energy demands as well, it means that they build up a lot of acidosis, and that makes the cellular environment more difficult for them to produce neuromuscular action, which has, you know, implications for force production. So heavyweights have to be able to deal with that acidosis in order to maintain their strength, which is to produce high forces. Now, in S&C, especially in conditioning, we can train to improve the ability to deal with that acidosis. And we do that through what we call muscle buffer training. So we will use a blood lactate analyzer to give us an indication of the level of acidosis. It doesn't give us the whole picture, but it does give us an indication of the level of acidosis that an athlete is experiencing at any point in time in their training. And what we like to do is get the athletes working to such an intensity that induces moderate to high levels of blood lactate concentration. And we can then say, okay, so we know that the muscle is under significant amount of cellular strain. And what happens over time is that if you repeat this type of muscle buffer training, is that you get an adaptation in what we call muscle buffers. So you can think of these as mops that go around and mopping up these metabolites that cause that acidosis. So it's one of the misconceptions. And if we put this out during if you're watching the athletics in the Commonwealth Games or the European Championships that are coming up, you'll hear commentators giving blood lactate and lactic acid a bad name. That does not cause fatigue. Actually, lactate is a really important metabolite. It's a cell signaling molecule. It's a fuel source. It doesn't cause cramp. It doesn't cause fatigue. It doesn't cause DOMS or any of the bad names that the commentators are going to give it. Or the lactate is flushing, and they need to go for a recovery to flush out all that kind of stuff. It's nonsense. We use it as a marker. So lactate's not one of the things that cause fatigue, but it's the hydrogen ions that come along with this high intensity actions that causes fatigue. So in the gym, when we're training an athlete at these high to moderate to high levels of acidosis, we're training these buffers that essentially come in and mop up these metabolites, and it enables the athlete then to continue what they want to do, which is to perform at a high intensity and produce high intensity actions. So there's a couple of classic ways in which we do this, and we can do it on the air bike, we do it on the curve, on the watt bike. Is a hard 2-minute interval, and after each interval or every other interval, we'll be taking a lactate assessment. And what we want is that in that interval to be of sufficient intensity, not completely fatiguing, but of sufficient intensity to raise that lactate value to quite similar value of what amateur boxers would experience from what we know from the scientific literature. So it becomes a fairly specific training modality, as well as being a specific training modality to improve physiological adaptations. And another way we can do it is with almost repeated sprints. So another session that we'll do is 12 seconds on, 48 seconds off, repeated anywhere from 15 to 20 times.
And you can get really fast adaptations from that.
Absolutely, yeah. Anything that is peripherally focused. Yeah. So the primary adaptations is at the muscle level here. Yeah. Anything that is peripheral, generally get a very fast adaptation.
Cool. Yeah. I need you to explain this to Fabio Wardley because he complains about the 30-second max sprints, 12 seconds on. He's just like, can't you just give me a red zone run? I'm like, no, you are heavyweight. Yeah. You need to deal with high levels of acidosis, especially like Fabio being really explosive, and AJ's that type as well. He's very fast switch, very powerful and explosive athlete. You need to be able to deal with them kind of them spikes in acidosis, and that's what we've seen in the past where he's potentially loaded up against, let's say Dillian White, where he gassed a little bit, really high pace as well, against Klitschko as well, that famous 5th round to the 6th round. Just putting that effort in, and you can see that he has adapted his ways to be able to go around the 12-round distance now. Yeah. You see it against Ruiz, that was more technical. Against Usyk, that was more technical as well, and he boxed really well. He probably tried to box too well against the boxer, but physically, you can see that he's coping with that high pace a lot better. Going to like that Klitschko fight where we've kind of discussed this when we're discussing about AJ's weight, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But he was around about 250 against Takam 254. He got a lot of criticism. He was getting too big, and we said that basically the reason why he's looking like he's getting stamina issues is potentially because he's not controlling the bout as well as what he could do. He's going very low and then having a spike in kind of punch output. So against Klitschko, from round 4 to round 5 where he knocked Klitschko down, he jumped up 40%, and the majority of this was due to power punches and trying to get Klitschko out of there. Obviously took a lot of damage from that round as well. We saw a similar one against Usyk. We saw a 38% increase from round 4 to round 5. It was hitting below the average and then went to 38% increase. But the difference is that I kept it quite high. I put that down to one, not taking as much damage as what I did against Klitschko, and also not loading up as much. But we're saying about like kind of what we can do from a strength and conditioning perspective to be able to control them spikes in acidosis. But what we're saying there with the pacing strategies have been really important. We're wanting to try and minimize the percentage increase between round by round. Now, what physical kind of responses do you get when you spike that intensity just like that, like from round 4 to round 5?
Yeah, physical and perceptual. We never, people rarely talk about the interaction between the two. But you need to launch an attack. You can't launch an attack from the lowest level platform.
Yeah.
You need to build that up. So you launch an attack from a high platform. That has a technical and strategic advantage as well, because you're working through the gears as you do that, and you're perhaps identifying opportunities to exploit your opponent's weaknesses as you do step up the gears. That also minimizes that shock that the body's going to receive from going, compared to if you go from a low baseline to a high baseline. So when we talk about perception, when we talk about performance is dictated by perception, and your perception has various inputs to it. So, and we can talk about this when we come on to the heat as well, but your performance and your intensity will be dictated by how well you feel. So your motivation or your drive to produce an intensity will be dictated by, well, is this hard or is this easy? Where should it be? And boxers will intuitively know where that level is. So they'll set a high bar. They'll know when they're going above that level of intensity or that perceived exertion. They'll know when they're below. They can choose when to go high. They can choose when to go low. So it's different to a lot of other sports because they can manipulate, especially in professional boxing, where that change in pace and that variation is important. It's different to like running or cycling, where you know you've got to hit a certain intensity. Like if you're doing your park run, you know it's going to be hard to very hard all the way around. If you're doing your 5K, whereas in professional boxing, there always is some variation in that. So things like, I mean, you're not wearing a heart rate monitor when you're boxing, but you do know, you can feel how fast your heart is beating. Anyone who's trained hard or who, done a bit of boxing training, you know that how hard your heart is beating, that has a perceptual input. The biggest perceptual input is in terms of breathlessness. And when we talk about perception, we usually assess it on a scale. That scale was created by Gunnar Borg. And if you look into the details of the Borg scale, actually a lot of it relates to breathlessness. So your ventilatory rate, so how deeply you're breathing, your respiratory rate, how quickly you're breathing, will determine your perception. This is where I also think body shots are really important, because if you can land body shots and those body shots are doing damage, you're also creating damage around those ventilatory muscles. So your intercostals, for example, in your diaphragm. And if you get one in the solar plexus and you're winded, that really does change the way that you feel about your breathing rate and your perception. So what that will do is that will cause your perception to go up. If perception goes up and it's higher, then something has to happen to bring it back down to where you think it needs to go. And the only thing that can happen is a reduction in output there. So the other thing that plays into this is when those spikes are occurring as well. So we have a pacing strategy, and everyone has pacing strategies, whether you're doing a bit of work. If you're a student and you've got an assessment, you'll start off, and I've given you a really exciting, I think it's an exciting assessment to do, and a student's gone away and they've gone, this is brilliant assessment, and they've cracked on with it. And then they've gone and found some literature and they're reading through it and thinking, this is hard to understand. So then the pace drops off, and then they get disinterested, and then the handing date looms, and then pick up the intensity, get it finished and submit it. It happens if you're doing housework. You start off thinking, I've got to do this housework, clean the kitchen because I don't want to do it. It's a boring job. It's rubbish. So you start off fast, and then your phone pings and you get distracted. And then you think, I need to finish this now because it's gone too long. And then you increase your pace. The same happens in performance as well, especially in running, especially in cycling, in that there's a fast start, followed by a dip in the middle, and then
you see the finish line.
The finish line, and you pick up the pace. If there is a disruption to perception in that middle part of the activity or performance, that will influence performance more than it would do at the start or at the end, because in the middle of the performance you get this dip, which is your brain saying, what level of intensity can I produce to complete this task with the minimal amount of physiological and psychological disruption? And so it's a protective mechanism. So if you then add intensity in that part, or your opponent imposes a demand in that middle part of the task, that's going to increase perception. And later on, that's going to have an influence into punch output
Yeah.
into intensity. So as well as the physical demands of increased cardiovascular demand, increased breathlessness, probably some change in acidosis and a spike in acidosis, and consequent demands to try and reduce that acidosis through oxidative metabolism. You've also got your perceptual inputs, and then you've got your psychological inputs on top of that. So it's not as simple as it might seem on the surface, because there are multiple layers of inputs to perception. So when people talk about, they've gassed out, I see that comment as being one-dimensional and focused only on cardiorespiratory aerobic fitness, when we know that there are multiple forms of fitness and multiple integrators to fitness and performance as well.
Yeah. And I think that you say, like looking at the numbers there, talk about the middle rounds, AJ did step it up, but it didn't necessarily land more. And Usyk, like, probably made him work a little bit harder there. And then 7, 8, and 9, that's where Usyk had a lot of success. And then 11 and 12 stepped it on the gas again. So that probably made it harder. And as well, working at that intensity and working with fighting somebody that's going to be creating questions and creating different dimensions all the way through the fight, that always seemed a lot harder for AJ. And that's what Bellew said as well. He was just mentally fatigued because he kept having to think, what is he going to be doing next? And that perception is a lot different to the physiological. Jordan said something really good the other day when we were talking about being in championship level fights. And he said that when you go at 100 mile an hour in a car, which you shouldn't do, we don't condone that. But when you go, if you go at 70 miles an hour in a car straight away, right, so we'll go 70 miles an hour, but that seems really fast. But if you take that up to 100 mile an hour, that'll seem really fast. But when you come back down to 70, it's still as fast as what you were going before, but it seems a lot slower because you've been up to that level. So now AJ could do exactly the same amount of training, come in at the same weight, do the same level of kind of intensity in terms of punch output and everything, and he won't find it as tough because he's already been there. So let's say if he thinks, and I do know he actually works with performance analysts and everything, they'll be looking at kind of these numbers and everything. If he takes that down to, let's say, his second highest punch output, which was 450, reducing it by about 30%, he's going to feel full of energy and able to push on. Usyk's style is constantly fading and stuff, and that's the reason why it's so successful. So it's going to be interesting to see how they both deal with the demands and as well talk about the heat demands and the weight as well. We'll talk about the weight first. We talked about AJ's weight. It's come down from 250, 254, about 245 against Ruiz. And then because when he lost to Ruiz, he thought, right, I'm going to drop down my weight. Since then, Ruiz 237, it's gone up to 240 for his last two fights. It seems like he's settling around about there. But the physical difference in his physique compared to when he fought Klitschko is massive, massive difference. Because even though it's a big difference, it's 10 pounds, which is less than 5% body mass difference. What significance does that actually have on his fitness compared to what is kind of taken away? He's probably taken away some strength, some power. He's probably not doing as much strength training to keep on that mass, and he's focusing more on fitness. But how much work does he actually have to do to make that impactful?
I think it comes down to, there's obviously a metabolic cost that is associated with each one of those activities, your jabs and your feints and your footwork. So that you have to be able to understand where that energy is coming from, what likely intensity that those activities are going to be, and factor that into your training. So yes, you could be lighter, but that change in body weight needs to be put in perspective to the strategy, but also what you're doing in your conditioning as well. So if the goal of being lighter is to move around more or throw more shots, you also have to think about, okay, so how am I going to support those demands from a metabolic perspective? What is the best, is it best for us to place our focus on to be able to support those metabolic demands? And so you can't get away from the fact that it's still a high intensity sport. So thinking, okay, so we need to do more fitness now and go on long road runs, that's not going to cut it.
No,
because that's not supporting the physiological demands of the sport, which is it's a high intensity intermittent sport. So you can't just go, okay, I'm gonna drop weight and then I'm just gonna do a lot of road running, and that's gonna help me lose a little bit more weight because I'll be in a greater negative energy balance, and it's also going to help my fitness as well. It needs to still be supported with high intensity conditions.
End of the day, is still 240 pounds.
Yeah,
still a big guy, 6'6".
Yeah,
full muscle.
Yeah.
You're saying about like kind of like when we're looking at Ruiz and like the amount of weight drop that he did, like how impactful would that be on his VO2 max, his relative VO2 max?
Yeah.
And it's like you're taking away probably a lot of strength, but you're not actually increasing your VO2 max that well.
Yeah.
So you're not really improving that fitness.
Yeah.
You're more, I think personally, like, I think that you could perform better around about 243, 245, so a little bit heavier, get that little bit stronger. I think he looks like he's put on a bit of mass, based off like the videos and what I've seen as well. Actually, they've been both quite secretive about the training. This time we haven't really seen a lot, but me and kind of like the photos and being at press conferences and stuff like that, it looks like he's put on a bit more mass. And I think that the strength training and being physically imposing will benefit AJ more by being that little bit heavier. You've just got to have the fitness to be able to deal with that.
The right type of fitness.
And that's what we've been working with Fabio Worthy with. I can't remember numbers off the top of my head, but he's put on around about 6 kilos since joining the Boxing Science program, and he's gone up bit by bit. He hasn't gone up, boom, 6 kilos straight away, putting on 6 kilos of lean mass. He's gone half kilo at a time, and now is strong and fit and able to take them physical characteristics to heavier weight, and that's what you need to. So the bigger that you are is often better as long as you're conditioning yourself. And they're the challenges that Usyk has when it's been creeping up. Obviously, we're under 200 pounds when he was boxing at cruiserweight, and he's gone up 215 against Chisora, and then it was 220 against AJ. And what people are saying from what they've seen at the press conference, it looks even bigger now. So it's going to be interesting to see what he is. I think he's going to come in about 224, I think. So 224, 225, just a few pounds heavier. You know, what kind of things that does he need to focus on? Like if he's gone heavier. Yeah. Again, pacing.
It's like if he is, and one of the things that we do focus on quite a bit is I mean, it doesn't matter so much with a heavyweight, but when do they hit their fight weight in fight camp? So how far away from fight night do they hit their target weight, and so how much sparring can they do at that weight as well? Because without having that information in sparring, and we know that AJ will record his sparring and he will have video analysts have a look at his sparring. But you need that information in order to make a good decision about how that mass is affecting or changing performance. And then you can start to make some decisions about the type of condition. I mean, you can make educated guesses fairly early on. So with Usyk creeping up in weight, he's got to make the same considerations that Joshua has had to make previously.
Throughout his career.
Throughout his career. And they're a smart camp. They're a smart camp. They'll know this. Usyk's smart. And he knows better than anyone how he feels. Every base is covered. He knows how he feels. He knows what at what weight he feels best at. And what he shouldn't look to do is try and second guess what Joshua's going to do. And Usyk should play to his own strengths. I think, and be his economical self.
It's interesting. This fight would be interesting if it was in this car park, but it's not taking place in this car park. It normally take place at somewhere like Wembley or Tottenham Stadium like last time. But this time it's in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, in the summer. You've been having a look at some of the environmental implications that this might have on the fight. Do you want to explain like kind of what the heat is there at the minute in August?
Hot.
Very hot. It's very hot. That's another video, another podcast.
So the fight will take place in the Jeddah Superdome, which is an air-conditioned stadium. So the heat might not be a factor at all.
How can you air condition a stadium that big?
I don't know. I have no idea. It could be packed with 35,000 people, and it could be air conditioned to 20 degrees Celsius. I don't know what it will be air conditioned to. But what I think is that, like the same question, how can you air condition that? Surely there's
it's open air. It's open air still, isn't it?
No, it's a dome.
Oh, is it a dome? Is it?
It's a dome. So how can you air condition for a stadium that big when the environmental temperature outside is so high? And I just think it's going to break. It's going to be under so much stress. What if it breaks?
Well, that's what happened. Fight Island with not Fight Island. It was 2019 when it happened. What's his name? Khabib.
All right.
Oh, how can I forget Khabib's name? Versus Poirier. The UFC in 2019. The aircon broke.
Did it?
And it was boiling, absolutely boiling. All the fighters were just like, we can't cope with this heat, like fighting in this heat. So, this is something that could happen.
It could happen. You never know what could happen. They might have to, there could be any number of possibilities. There could be a security scare, somehow, and they've got to tighten up on their security and move the fight to another location that is open air. There's all sorts that could happen. Mechanical things, risks to human health and harm. Anything could happen.
At the end of the day, you're still fighting in a hot country.
Exactly, still fighting in a hot country. So I've looked at the weather conditions, the predictions for the 20th of August. So I've looked at historical temperature data. I've looked at the temperatures and humidity for the exact date from last year as well. And there's when you look at like the overview of the temperature, it gives you these descriptive, these qualitative indicators of how hot the temperature is. And for that point for August, the description for Jeddah is sweltering.
Sweltering. The science.
It's not just hot.
They've heard it from Dr. Heat himself. It's sweltering.
The prediction is sweltering in terms of temperature. In terms of humidity, it's at least muggy.
Muggy, So what temperatures are there then in Celsius? It's about 40, 45?
Through the day, through the day, it's around 40 degrees Celsius with like a extremely high solar load as well. Humidity is higher in the morning and then in the evening as well. So if we base the fight time on Ruiz Joshua,
quite late.
That was midnight.
Yeah.
Saudi time.
Really cold, actually.
Yeah, it was cold because that was December.
Yeah.
And there are, so August is sweltering and muggy, but that doesn't tell us anything about what's going to happen on the day. So the temperature at midnight outside is predicted to be about 32, anywhere between 30 and 32 degrees Celsius.
Still hot.
Yeah, with a humidity of about 50 to 60%, which is oppressive for Europeans.
Yeah,
that's hot. In December, which is when Ruiz Joshua was, it was cool at that time.
Yeah.
It wasn't cold, but it was outdoor. It was cool. So much more manageable.
Yeah.
So you can't make comparisons.
Yeah.
For the two, unless we say, okay, it's going to be an aircon stadium. That's going to be similar to the conditions.
Yeah.
For Ruiz.
How does that impact the performance then in terms of, like, let's say air conditioned is all going to be fine. Leading up to it, it's going to be hot.
Yeah.
Usyk's been training in Dubai more or less all the time because obviously what's happening in his country. And then Joshua has gone out to Saudi Arabia with 4 weeks to go. Who's at the advantage here?
Depends on what they're doing when they're in there, doesn't it?
One thing being there, but then is actually what are you actually
doing when you're there?
Yeah.
And preparing for those specific conditions. So you could. There's huge advantages from having a heat acclimation strategy.
Yeah.
Whether you're in a temperate condition or whether you're in a hot condition. Actually, the research is equivocal.
Yeah.
But it's probably always, if you can get the level of intensity that you need in training, there's probably always more reward from doing heat acclimation training than not, just in case. Plus, athletes get hot in competition.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's research, by the way. But you know yourself in the Middle East. It's hot when you're outside walking from building to building, but because it's so hot, you seek the air-conditioned buildings because it's much more comfortable. So although the training camps might be in the Middle East, they might be predominantly in an
air-conditioned,
so in that respect, it's probably not going to do any good.
No.
I remember when I was in Vegas with Kel, we were at the top ranked gym, which is not air conditioned one bit.
It might be now. 8 years.
Yeah, 8 years. Yeah, and it was 38 degrees outside. It was absolutely roasting in there. I took the temperature inside, and it was 32 degrees, I think, if not pushing 35 degrees. No air circulation at all, so it was really hot. And he was in there for 3 weeks.
Yeah,
training in those, sparring in those conditions, which it wasn't a focus of the camp, but as a byproduct, he probably got some benefit from doing that. Sean Porter was training in his air-conditioned gym. Nice.
Yeah, nice, comfortable.
Nice and comfortable.
So, like, even though Usyk and Joshua have gone out there, if they're in comfort in terms of like being air-conditioned, they won't actually get the heat acclimation work that they're seeking from being there.
No.
What would you do then? Would you say like to train probably at night, like where it's going to be safer to train but still have that heat acclimation, where it's 32 degrees? high humidity.
I mean, this is another consideration that they've got to make. For us, it's not normal to box at 12 o'clock at night.
No.
Ring walks for AJ of what normally 10:30.
Yeah.
Same with Usyk when they're headlining cards. So, although it doesn't sound much of a difference 10:30 till 12, it probably will make quite a bit of difference in terms of their circadian rhythms. So if they can train in an evening more specific to their fight time, that would be better from a circadian rhythm perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you say as well, the conditions at that time on an evening outdoors are much more manageable than earlier in the day, midday, for example, where these guys would step out for 10 minutes and just feel completely drained in those conditions. So it's choosing the time of day that's more specific to the fight and perhaps going to be more specific to the conditions that they might have to box in if there was something wrong with the Superdome.
Yeah.
So I think you're spot on by saying training later in an evening, and inducing some heat and getting used to that heat.
Yeah.
In terms of the physiological adaptations that are induced through heat acclimation, their impact will actually be minimal on their ability to lose heat. Now, that ability is dictated by their sweat rate. They're big guys. They're used to sweating a lot, so their sweat rate will be super high. But it's no good in having a super high sweat rate if you can't dissipate heat to the environment. And the things that contribute to that heat dissipation or determine that heat dissipation are environmental temperature and humidity. The hotter it is, the more water vapor that can be stored in that environment. The more water vapor there is, the higher the pressure of that water vapor is on the skin. So for evaporation to work off the skin's surface, there needs to be a pressure gradient and a large pressure gradient. So the pressure of the water on the skin surface needs to be higher so you can get that diffusion and you can get that evaporation of heat off the skin surface, because there's a gradient somewhere for that water to go into the atmosphere. But because the heat and the humidity is so high, that pressure is just sitting here, making it much more difficult to evaporate.
Sweat to evaporate.
So that avenue of cooling becomes much limited. One of the temperature metrics that we use to determine how thermally stressful an environment is something called the wet bulb globe temperature. That's something for you to practice, mate. The wet bulb globe temperature takes into account solar radiation, it takes into account air temperature in the shade, takes into account humidity, and it takes into account air speed. And like I said, when you're thinking about evaporation, the air temperature is important, humidity is important. In terms of convection, so airflow against the skin, that can help remove heat as well. So that takes into account that air speed metric in wet bulb globe temperature. That, if we do a crude estimation, it's around about 25 degrees Celsius for midnight outdoors in Jeddah. Now, when you produce energy, you also produce heat. And as humans, we're really inefficient. And surprise, surprise, there's no research that has been done on the efficiency of a heavyweight boxer. So we don't know how efficient they are. But even in the most efficient, economical of situations, we're probably only about 20%, 25% efficient, which means that 80% of the energy that we produce goes as heat, and only 20% is used as effective mechanical work. So we've got this bulk of metabolism that's creating heat. That heat needs to go somewhere. It needs to get from the muscles it needs to get into the blood, it needs to be circulated to the skin, and then that heat needs to be dissipated.
Mm-hmm.
So that has a cardiovascular demand. It has a thermoregulatory demand because of the requirements of vasodilation of the skin and of sweating as well. Now, heavyweights are big people as well. So their rate of metabolism is also super high.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we'll do with those two metrics, wet bulb globe temperature and metabolic rate, is we'll look at whether or not they combine to create a compensable environment or an uncompensable environment. In a compensable environment, we can evaporate and we can use heat loss mechanisms to control body temperature until you get to a certain wet bulb globe temperature where the environment then makes that situation uncompensable. Heat loss mechanisms cannot then attain a steady state in core temperature if you maintain a steady metabolic rate. So what happens then is core temperature, body temperature starts to go up, and that's where things start to go wrong. So for both boxers, if they were to compete outdoors, even at midnight, 32 degrees Celsius, 50% humidity, for their metabolic rate, their environment would be uncompensable. So there's only one thing that can happen there, and that's for them to reduce their output. So that's where shot selection, if that was to happen, shot selection is super important because as we mentioned, every shot that they take has a metabolic cost. So in those situations, do you really want to be feinting a lot?
Yeah.
Especially with a jab. Feint with your feet might be more economical. Feint with your head might be more economical. But throwing a jab, missing, that's not economical. It's not effective work.
Yeah.
Closing your opponent down, throwing a power shot, although it might be more metabolically costly in the overall scheme of things, it might be more mechanically effective. It might be more effective from a performance standpoint. Another thing that I think would be effective, which would be really boring from a spectator point of view, is that AJ could use his size and height advantage and just press down on Usyk and just hold him.
A lot of people thought that they should have done that in the first fight.
Yeah.
With the heat demands being quite high and humidity and all the stuff that you just talked about there, without having an impact, that could be even more effective.
Massively effective. Really boring, but something that Fury does really, really well.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure he looked at wet globe. What is it?
Wet bulb globe temperature.
Wet bulb globe temperature. I'm sure Fury looked at that and
I thought,
decided,
you know what, I'm
going to lean on people.
But things like, this, the amount that the temperature will play in strategy shouldn't be underestimated. If it has to change or something happens with the aircon in the stadium, has a massive implications. Huge.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. Let's see what happens.
We'll see.
August 20th. So yeah, it's been great to pick your brains on stuff from a physiological standpoint, and obviously with the heat and everything like that. Let's see what happens with Usyk Joshua 2.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Predictions.
Our predictions. I've got AJ win.
What, based on?
Based upon the fact that, like you're saying, at 100 mile an hour, he had to fight against Usyk. And he boxed the best he's ever boxed.
Yeah.
So he's made some massive improvements in the way that he can box. And so I think he's added more to his game there.
Yeah.
We also know that he could add more physicality into his game as well.
How much better can AJ get compared to how much better can Usyk get?
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Like, for me, like, before we went into all this, I was thinking Usyk, because skill for skill, Usyk's better. And physically, that obviously AJ's taller, is 20 pounds heavier, but in relative terms, 20 pounds heavier in the heavyweight division isn't as big as what 20 pounds is when you're against featherweight versus a middleweight. But it's talking about this, like saying about like how much AJ can get better from a pacing perspective, from physical perspective. Obviously, he's changed boxing trainers now and they've learned how to cope with the demands of what Usyk brings.
And also, he's been around different camps as well.
Yeah.
He's gone around. He's literally gone around the world, hasn't he? Picking up bits. He's probably learned loads.
I think obviously what's going off with Usyk's country at the moment, that could have a big factor on Usyk. Can take a lot away. It can either distract or it can empower somebody.
Like looking from the outside, something like that would just empower Usyk.
Yeah, and then it's basically it's shit or bust for AJ as well, because if he loses the rematch, then when's his next shot? Obviously, he needs to win the rematch, and then he gets Fury, gets back on top. He's going to want it more than ever, and it looks like he's been putting in the work. And all the environmental implications as well could limit the amount of work that Usyk does, which will help AJ.
Yeah.
So might still sit on the fence. I think I still like kind of edge towards Usyk, but I'm more favoured now towards AJ before we looked at it, and that's why we're doing this conversation. Hopefully that helps some people as well. They might.
One thing that's really important, mate, is momentum, and this not the physical construct of momentum, like we'd explain science behind a punch, but the psychological momentum.
Yeah.
And Usyk had psychological momentum when he beat Joshua.
Yeah.
But because of the period of time and what's happened in between the first fight and this fight,
which is nearly a year now.
Yeah. That momentum will have slowed.
Yeah.
Severely. Heavyweights are completely different animals to normal human beings. So when they get a little bit of confidence, their rise in confidence is exponential. And their fearlessness is exponential compared to normal human beings.
Yeah.
So we would still have a degree of trepidation. I have trepidation wherever.
Yeah.
I still see risk wherever.
Yeah.
But these top level heavyweights are different, and AJ is different to what he appears, in the media. And I just think he's now got the momentum.
Yeah.
From all those things that you just mentioned, and he's probably got a lot more confidence back. And I think even though he lost, there's still loads of confidence he can take from that fight. Loads. And plus he's got his history in his back pocket.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. I can't wait for the fight now.
Yeah. Very good.
So that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you stuck with us for this time, we're going through the science behind AJ versus Usyk. Sorry, Usyk versus Joshua 2. Now leave your predictions below. Have we swayed your prediction? And let's look forward to August 20th. I'm buzzing for it now. So hopefully see you on the next video.